Welcome to Lovin, Coven, where we share tools, resources, and stories to reclaim our magic. This is for all the passionate creatives and hopeful romantics in the world that value connecting, creating, and wanting to make a positive impact. This is your host, Andrea or Treya, and I invite you to take a deep breath, get cozy, and stay a while. Hello, and welcome back to Lovin Coven podcast. I am here with a guest that is joining me once more. I am so honored to have Yaffa back here again. Yaffa is an incredible speaker, writer, author, a consultant, a death and birth doula, among so many other things, also a stand-up comic. And I love that one of your stand-ups talked about how you do all of these different things, kind of like, it's the immigrant way. It's just how we are. We do so much. And I find that so true. So Yaffa, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to the audience, saying hello, and anything else I may have missed.
Yeah, hi everyone. First off, Andrea, thank you so much for having me back here. It was so great being here the first time. I'm so excited for today's episode. I know we're talking about some difficult conversations, but I find that even the most difficult of conversations spoken within a space of a lot of love and compassion is regenerative versus really difficult. So really excited to be here. So hi everyone, my name's Yaffa. I go with they, she pronouns. I live out on Ohlone land, known as Oakland, California. I've been out here for about a year. I've lived in about 9 different countries. And if it wasn't obvious from the way I'm dressing, I am a displaced Indigenous Palestinian. And so I've lived in 9 different countries and close to a dozen states or so, just kind of moved all around as displaced folks are kind of forced to. I'm also a queer trans person. I'm autistic. And so all of those identities are really important to me in the conversations that we're having and the way that I show up to the work. And I'm also a writer. And so I'm really excited to be releasing a poetry collection about Palestine November 13th, where the prophets from the book called Blood Orange will be donated to support queer and trans Palestinians.
Yes, I am so excited, not just at um at knowing that this book is going to come out and all of the great impacts that it's going to have, but getting the chance to read some of it myself. It is so powerful and impactful that we continue sharing and uplifting Palestinian stories, and the way in which you share about your identities and being displaced is so powerful. So thank you for that. I am really excited as well for some of the audience to get to hear one of your poems later on. So definitely stick around so you can hear some of that later. And it makes me feel good to know that having these conversations, though hard, can also be regenerative, as you mentioned, when you are in a space of compassion and understanding. And I'm so grateful that I am able to provide that. I want to say that this is also our first video podcast, which I'm so excited about. So thank you, Yaffa, for being on the inaugural Love and Coven video podcast. And as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about some very difficult subjects today. So definitely resource yourself, and also stay informed and stay to listen, because I think that these conversations, though hard, are so important. And it can be heavy to hear, but it is so much heavier to experience. So realizing the privilege first off, that I've had to not have known about this until recently. You know, if you are living in the US and you are removed from Israel or Palestine, occupied Palestine, really, if you are removed and don't know about what is going on, if you don't have family from there, you have the privilege to stay ignorant. And it's been I've had to go through different waves of emotions of realizing how uneducated I was, but then empowering myself, knowing that I can educate myself and that it's my responsibility to stay informed and to speak up and to share. And I'm so happy to have this platform to do so. So I'm going to start talking about some of the things I've seen and experienced, and then I'll have Yaffa chime in on what they are experiencing themselves and anything else they might want to add to the conversation as we go along. So as we all know, right now, there is a genocide being placed against Palestinians. They are blocked in Gaza with nowhere to go, and their water, fuel, electricity has been cut off. I've been speaking out about this in my stories, and people have come to me saying that I am anti-Semitic, that I am a Hamas supporter. And though that's been very hurtful, it is far from the truth. I am the granddaughter of a Jewish woman. I've lived with and been in community with Jewish people most of my life. They've been my first employers. They've been my mother's first employers. And we've lived in Jewish communities. We lived in a Jewish community for a long time as I was growing up. So I don't want anyone to think this has anything to do with anyone wanting anything bad against Jewish people, because this is what the Israeli government is doing. And there seems to be some conflation between the two. With me speaking up against the Israeli government, I am not speaking up against Jewish people or Israeli people for that matter, because they are not the same. Just as Hamas and Palestine are not one and the same. Hamas is a Palestinian group, but they are not, they do not represent all of Palestine and all of their people. So what first off caused someone to call me anti-Semitic is because I posted about the misinformation happening. There is a lot of propaganda right now because Israel is a very powerful country. And just to get into some of the numbers, US gives Israel 8.5 million daily, which is over $3 billion in our hard-earned tax dollars to their military for specifically military aid. So really, it is our money that is funding this genocide, which is the really sad, scary truth, and really, pains me when people don't care to speak up about it or kind of look the other way. Like, we are very much complicit in this. So what someone said is that there was I posted that there was misinformation, and particularly on the beheading of babies, which has not been proven, confirmed anywhere, because it is not true. This is something that was used to, again, dehumanize Palestinians, to make Palestinians look like they are in the wrong, when this war is nowhere near, this genocide is nowhere near even. Palestine does not have a military. They do not have the power to cut off all of Israel's resources. This is so disproportionate. It's unreal to be witnessing in real time. And this is why I'm here today. This is why we are engaging and having this conversation. Um, I'd love for you, Yaffa, to talk about any of those points. You know, I'm obviously no expert in this, and I have nowhere near the experience that you do in this outright genocide, this apartheid state that uh, you and your loved ones have been living in. Is there anything that you can talk on in regards to the misinformation, propaganda, or any of the points that I touched on?
Yeah, so many things. Um, First off, thank you for sharing all of that. Um, and it's always interesting to me where people experience this for the first time as they come into it. Um, like you said, this is kind of like your deep dive into it, right? And it is for a lot of folks. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really interesting because it's always the exact same. So, folks who have been seeing this, right, for the last 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 75 years, it's a same pattern, right, in terms of how information is shared, in terms of how that misinformation exists, in terms of just it's the same exact pattern. Now, I would actually love for people to take a step back completely from Palestine for a second and just really check in of like, do they understand what settler colonialism is? Like, do they know what imperialism is? Like, genuinely, like outside of the context of Palestine, but do you know what settler colonialism means? Do you know what colonization is? Do you know the difference? And if you don't, that's your starting point. Not even Palestine, not even Armenia, right? Not even this land, but like that is your starting point because ultimately it's the exact same story again and again and again and again. And it, otherwise, we kind of look at it as like, oh, like occupied Palestine forces are like really creative. Like, oh my God, they created this story of 40 babies being decapitated. They couldn't have created it, right? Like, it must be true because who's going to create that? But the reality is, white people have been sharing that exact same story for hundreds of years against Indigenous people. It's always about children,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's how they justified the first initial forms of genocide, right, against Indigenous folks in the Americas. It's how they justified slavery. It's how they justified everywhere else, right? Everywhere in Africa, everywhere in Asia, everywhere, just wherever. It's always the exact same narrative. And people not understanding that always puts them at a disadvantage in terms of trying to understand Palestine in the current context that we're living in, because it all seems so new. It all seems so fresh. Like it's a very unique situation. But for me and for a lot of us who have had to live through this our entire lives, it's not a unique situation. So, for example, I currently live in occupied Ohlone land, right? I recognize that I am a settler here, even though I'm a displaced Indigenous person that literally has nowhere else to go. I will always be a settler wherever I am in the world because I am not permitted to go home to Palestine. Right. And so, without understanding that context and those layers of settler colonialism, of how it's so similar here, right, on occupied Ohlone land, as it is in like Northern Ireland, where I was living right before moving here for a couple years, and how it's the same in Palestine, it it makes it seem so much more complex than it really is. But in reality, it's just a very basic truth. This is settler colonialism. Settler colonialism leads to genocide. That is the purpose of it. There is no such thing as settler colonialism that does not have genocide as a tool within it. It's not possible.
Mm-hmm.
But most people don't get that. They don't understand that this is a part of a larger thing, that it's not just, oh, there's this conflict, right? There's two groups that are fighting, right? Two groups doing really bad things. Um, and I think part of people not understanding that provides so much space for people who are upholding settler colonialism, right, and genocide practices to really deflect from the conversation. So the fact that Hamas even comes up in most conversations, right, or the 40 babies, is a part of that, is a lack of understanding for the foundation of what settler colonialism is. Because if you really think about it, and people are not going to like me saying this, right? So we're talking about 40 decapitated babies that were never actually decapitated. But let's say they were. Does that justify what is happening? Does that justify 75 years of settler colonial occupation? Does that justify close to 500 years here? Does it justify over 600 years in Ireland? And the reason for a lot of people that is a deal breaker, that is a line that you cannot cross, is because we are talking about 40 white babies, right? Over 1,000 kids have been murdered in Gaza, right? Literally just in the last week, let alone all the other times, right? Like that number is, you can't even count it, right? So if you're really worried about children, you can't even count it. You can't count how many Indigenous folks worldwide have been murdered or beheaded even, right? Like literally just take a single form, whether we're talking about like the atrocities that happened here on this occupied land, what happened in what is known in Canada, and that occupied land, in Australia with the Aboriginals, all over Africa, literally everywhere they have not left anything alone, right? To try to calculate that. And yet that number has so many zeros. But for most people, 40 is a deal breaker. If it was one, it's still a deal breaker because it's a white child compared to non-white people, which are not worth the same. And most people don't recognize that they feel that way, again, because they don't have that foundation into what is settler colonialism. But the reason they don't have that understanding is because of settler colonialism. Because settler colonialism is literally a practice. It's not even so colonization is basically the robbing of the pillaging of resources, right? You're going to a land that is not yours. It's kind of what the British Empire did. They went to like India, for example, took all the resources, used the native populations for labor, right? Took everything, destroyed everything in the process, but the native population, for the most part, were left there because they were needed as labor because it was colonization versus settler colonization. Settler colonization is that plus you actually don't want the natives there. And so you get rid of the natives. So we're thinking of places like the United States, Canada, Australia, South Africa, thinking of what is known as Israel. Those are all settler colonial spaces where the entire purpose of their being is saying, we are so much more worthy than you. Not only do we take all of the resources, you also need to go. So, what Israel is doing now to Gaza and the West Bank and sending missiles to Lebanon and Syria, it's all just a part of it. It's not unique. It's not really surprising in a lot of ways. It just is settler colonialism. Um, and I think, again, that part is something that most people have not really contented with. And I think a part of that is because when you really do that, you really have to contend with who you are in the world. And that includes for most people that might be listening to this and that both of us might be interacting with, that they're also settlers, right? And what does that mean to be a settler in a space? And thinking of if Native folks here um, were to rebel, right, against the US government, and for example, I die in the process, to me, I get it. To me, it's not, oh, Indigenous folks are awful because I died as a settler. I am a settler. I'm not supposed to be here. But for people to kind of comprehend that, of like, I have a role to play, that I am part of this process, that I'm feeding off of space. And by settlers, I don't include Indigenous folks to this land and Black folks specifically, um, right, where it's a different kind of Indigenous displacement, right? And
Mhm.
so just wanted to make that really clear of I'm talking about like folks that would be more considered as immigrants. So like mostly like brown people, right? Or folks from Asia and things like that. Um, and even if you're marginalized, you can still be a settler, right? So again, displaced Indigenous person, I am still a settler. um, Yeah, and so I wanna invite folks to really contend with that, to really think about that before they jump into any specific politics. You can't understand Mozambique, for example, without understanding colonization, right? Like, you would not understand that the US and, like, the European countries are funding every single group that are fighting within certain African nations because that's how colonization works, right? You make sure that stability never happens. But you wouldn't understand that if you don't understand what colonization is in the first place. So take a step back, would be my advice for everyone. Take a step back, understand settler colonialism first before you jump into anything else and have opinions about anybody or anything or different forms of resistance or whatever it is, because it will always be not adequate in a way. It won't be the full image. And so it's not going to be as transformative as we would like it to be. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think that is definitely something that people need to become more informed on and know their part within. And this isn't, at least for me, it's not like you should feel bad that you're a settler. Like we kind of all are. Many of us, not by choice, but it's our role to know the role that we're playing in whatever place we're in. And this was definitely a bit of like a rude awakening for some people to realize the parts that they're playing, right? I think many of us may have started that work in 2020, myself included, which at that point I was just so disappointed in myself for not realizing it earlier. Like, how have I just been living, you know, in like a bubble, not realizing all of the things going on? But I've grown to really have compassion and patience with myself during this process because it's not easy. It's not easy realizing everything that the countries we're a part of are doing and being complicit in. And so I definitely um, implore you to do this work and to do it with patience and compassion for yourself as well. And with that, I would like to shift shift gears maybe just a little bit, but still obviously within the same realm. Um, Talking about engagement in particular, because I know that so many of my friends and myself, I've definitely started being very vocal and speaking up about what is happening. I obviously have a bit more information and context around colonialism and my part in that, and I've been doing decolonizing work within myself and my practices for a few years now. Um, and first, I want to say what I am doing. So maybe that will help people feel a little bit more empowered, because I think that we can feel very helpless in these situations too, where some of us are just gonna, go up in arms like, okay, well, what can I do? This is in Palestine and I'm here. So I guess I'm just gonna keep going about my day as usual. And first off, like, what a privilege to just go on about our day as usual, because not many people are not being afforded that right now. But also, there is so much that we can do, I feel like, at least. And obviously, many of it may not be directly changing things right away. It's a slow moving, um, a slow moving path. But for me, some of the things that I've done that at least help me feel like I'm moving forward and not just putting my arms up and saying, "Oh well." I've of course been speaking out about this throughout since it started the last week, a little bit over a week, and just and right now, there are so many Palestinians sharing their stories because they don't know if they'll ever get a chance to be heard again. They don't know if they will live to see tomorrow. And I feel like it's really important that we are sharing their stories, sharing who they are, sharing about their culture and their people. So one thing that's easy and free that we can all do is share, and obviously trying to come from an informed place. I have put a little bit, like some tidbits in my story highlights on my Instagram of different educational sources because, like I said, I'm not an expert. So I am sending you to the experts to learn from them. I implore you to stay educated and informed in these subjects. Another thing that I have done is donate to people on the ground and humanitarian efforts. There are I listed a few on my Instagram as well. Right now, the ones that I know that are doing work on the ground are Mecca for Peace, which is Muslim Alliance for Children in Palestine. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the acronym. So my apologies. I should have had this written out, but that is one. There's also the PCRF. So these and a couple others as well. There's one that's medical aid PAL, so medical aid straight to Palestine, and then UNRWA, which has is is associated with the UN. So do with that what you may. And just know that all of these charities have 4 out of 4 stars on charity rating. If that is something you're concerned with, you know that your money is going to where they say it is going. And the last piece that I wanted to talk about is okay, as an immigrant myself, I have also had other immigrant friends reach out because they're interested in being engaged, but they are fearful of uh, of any retaliation should they choose to get engaged. And Yaffa corrected, let me know that the acronym for Mecca is Middle East Children's Association. Thank you for that, Yaffa. And so for those that are worried about getting engaged but still want to, I wanted to kind of chat about those people because I remember being very scared to go to protests in 2020 because my status in this country was a temporary one. And I did go to a protest, and at the end, things started getting, of course, a little violent because people are angry, and rightfully so. But after that, I chose to stop going and engage in other ways because I was fearful about my status. So I'm curious if you have anything to say from one immigrant to another, Yaffa, of how immigrants can stay involved, stay engaged. And if you'd like to add to any of those different forms that I mentioned of like sharing, donating, going to a protest, staying informed.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with the immigrant piece and then kind of work outwards from there. Um, yeah, I find that a lot of immigrants, depending on different statuses, also just don't know the consequences of and the realities of how retaliation works in a lot of ways. And so there are a lot of retaliatory practices that will be happening and have already been happening. Um, it could be slightly different depending on the status that you have. However, for the most part, even if you're a permanent resident, if you get arrested, you could still get deported. The only thing that saves you from deportation, and even that barely, is citizenship. And the reason I say even that barely is because after 9/11, the US still deported and revoked individual, specifically Muslims, citizenships. And so things like that could still happen. So something to be mindful of, even if your status is very secure, if you are a US citizen and you're not concerned about those things, um, just be mindful that that's possible. Oftentimes, they will go after individuals who will not have any kind of protection, right? And so being really mindful of keeping track of lists of different legal authorities that you're able to contact and have folks represent you. The organization that I run, Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity, Meshid, is actually releasing a guide that was actually created a few years ago from other individuals for like a know your rights almost, and that includes a lot of different information for immigrants in particular, both in terms of protests and outside of that. But I'll start with protests. So with protests, be really mindful. This isn't saying don't go to protests if you have a certain status. Just be really mindful with it. So, for example, I still go to protests. I'm a permanent resident as of a few years ago, but I've been going to protests since I was like 6 years old in this country. Um, you the advice that I would give, and it's going to be different for different people, different places. But for me personally, this is kind of what I do. I will generally go towards the beginning of a protest, and then I will leave before the scheduled end time. Generally, situations get out of hand more towards the end. I will also avoid the front lines where, and by the front lines, I don't necessarily mean the front lines. I mean where there's the counter protesters and you're the front line against the counter protesters. Counter protesters, like even just the protest I went to a couple weeks ago or like 10 days ago out here in San Francisco, the amount of rape threats that they will be throwing out, the just horrific things that they will say to rile people up. And the cops will be so clear and will say that they are there to protect the counter protesters when it comes to something like this. So they're not there to support any of us, right? And so if you say the smallest of thing, you will get arrested. Because their job is to maintain the peace, which means the peace of white people, right? Specifically the most privileged of white people. And so generally I will avoid that part, and be really mindful of different pathways, be really mindful of where the cops are standing. Some could be undercover cops, so you never know. But generally, I try to leave before anything could potentially happen. It's not a fail-safe way, so it's not like this is what I recommend. This is just what I do to keep myself safe when it comes to that. Beyond that, I find it's always interesting to me of like I would love to see way more trainings around protest safety. So you'll notice that the counter protesters will always be taking pictures of the protesters. Protesters will not be taking pictures of counter protesters. So if you're at a at a protest, you're most likely going to be documented as being there. And so, especially in the age of COVID, it is so easy to just wear a mask, wear sunglasses, one or the other, whatever it is that's going to give you a little bit of plausible deniability for whether you're there or not. Because one, that could go and be sent to immigration, causing people a lot of problems potentially, because so much of immigration is just about the person who's actually reviewing your application. So it's not, oh, you meet these criterias, and so you will be fine. It's, oh, you meet these criterias, but ultimately it's up to the person behind a desk to say yes or no. And if that person is pro Zionism or something like that, right? And I go into the office dressed like this, they could easily just say no. Now, at the same time, with being inside of the country, there are things that immigration lawyers can do to support and challenge those things and appeal and things like that. However, if you're leaving the country and you're trying to come back into the country, they don't have to let you in for for no reason whatsoever. And there's nothing that anyone can really do to force them to get you into the country. So if you're not a US citizen, be really mindful of how you're traveling today and how you're sharing different things, on things like social media and just the way that you're showing up, because some of that could be used against you. If you're a permanent resident with the coming in and out, it's much better, I will say. Um, but even then, it's harder for them to reject you, but they still can. So just things to be really mindful of. And then the other thing that surveillance, the reason surveillance is bad is because if you're here on a work visa, right, or anything related to employment, I don't know about y'all, but like I don't trust employers. Most employers are going to be absolute shit. Right. And so being really mindful of that, because you could lose your job. And if you lose your job, that means you lose your status. That means you get deported. Um, and I'm hearing a lot of, especially like tech companies, blacklisting individuals who are going to protests. Even students from like Harvard and things like that are terrified to go to protests because they're being blacklisted. And Zionist professors at those universities are publicly calling for firms to blacklist people, which is absolutely disgusting that people think that that's ethical in any way, shape, or form. So even out in Berkeley, I just read that there's a law professor that's calling for firms to not hire people going to pro-Palestinian protests. So just be mindful of those things. This isn't saying don't do it, um, but you always want to be conscious of the consequences that are possible for you so that you're able to make decisions that are best for you and your family. Now, outside of that, like you mentioned, of donations, amplifying voices um, of folks who are on the ground in Gaza and Palestinians everywhere. There's some beautiful voices out there. So definitely try to follow as many of us as you possibly can, and share the content that we make. The content that we make, period, not just the content that we make that you agree with, that you're ready for. And actually, if there's something that you're not ready for, share it more because you're just getting started, right? And I say this like as a blanket statement for everyone, right? If you're not living this as a daily reality, just like for me trying to share things around Black folks, that is not my lived reality. I am not going to go and have an opinion about what is best for Black people. That is not my space or my job or anything like that. It is not my place to be like, ooh, this sounds really extreme. Are all cops really bad? Yes, they are. And also, it's not my place to have an opinion. I get to share what other people are sharing that have opinions that are different than mine, right? And being really careful of not sharing just the things that you agree with, because we're also diverse people, right? Like even across Palestinians, you're going to have very different understandings of even this, right? That like there are people who are third generation like Palestinian Americans here, right? Like, and then there's others who kind of more like me who have lived in 9 different countries, right? Have been refugees and immigrants and have been in an active war zone. And that's our lived reality. It's not just our parents, it's not just our grandparents, it's that we have been there. Um, and then there's also the reality of people who have never left there, who are who have never known anything outside of Gaza, who have never known anything outside of the West Bank, and the realities of that. And those are all very, very, very different experiences, and different layers of privilege, and it gets really complex. But generally, find people that you don't agree with, right? If you don't understand this, right? If you fully understand this and you've been doing this work for a really, really long time, and you know what you're talking about, then you're fine. You probably have good people around you. But generally, if you don't know what settler colonialism is and how that fits into your own community and the world that you live in, find people you disagree with. Most likely are going to be right versus the people that you agree with, who are most likely just upholding settler colonialism narratives in a lot of different ways. Um, the question that I would ask folks beyond all of that, and this isn't about immigrants, this is completely beyond that for just everyone, um, is really a question for folks to consider, not necessarily have an answer for today or tomorrow or whenever, not necessarily about Palestine, just in general, is what are you willing to give up, right? If you do have those kinds of privileges, right? Like if you're not going to get deported immediately, um, but also if, for example, if I don't know, 40 million immigrants wanted to like rise up and be like, fine, we will get deported. Guess what? They're not going to deport all of us, right? Like But even if they do, right, this country would completely fall apart. Completely fall apart. It would just be completely destroyed, right? Let them deport all of us. But so if 40 million wanted to do that, that's very different than you just as one person being deported. That doesn't necessarily help a cause. Because we want to do this as sustainably as possible. However, I will say for us to create the world that we want to actually live in, where settler colonialism no longer exists and genocide is not a daily thing that's constantly at our doorsteps, people need to give up things. And this isn't saying be miserable, but this is saying, what do you stand for and what's more important, right? And again, this isn't about Palestine. This is larger than that. This is a much larger conversation. And I really wish more people would really interrogate that question and have that conversation with themselves, with their families, because the vast majority of people don't want to give anything up. Like even things as simple as like, would you ride the bus for a month if that would actually be helpful? And even if you have to like walk around, and I'm talking about like non-disabled folks, right, where that's available to you, and you're walking around and accessing public transportation, that's absolutely disastrous in this country. So even something like that, would you do that? Would you give just 1 month, right, of comfort for a greater purpose? And most people have not interrogated that, would not give up their jobs, would not give up their school, their children's schools, would not give up um, access to wealth, right? Access to security, like what is seen as wealth and security. I was doing another podcast actually a couple of weeks ago, and I was saying of like to the people who are constantly like, oh, but like comfort, and it's like, Sally, you're not comfortable. You just live in a 6-bedroom house. Your kids hate you. You're like destroying the environment. You're afraid of the ghosts in the other rooms. Like, where is the comfort? Like, you're going to die rich. Sure. You'll get a fancy coffin, right? And like a really fancy headstone. And people are going to pretend to cry when you die. But like, where is the comfort? Right? Because like I've been in war zones. And also, like, sometimes that could feel way more comfortable because you're actually with people that mean something, that stand for something. Um, and so, just a question for folks to really interrogate and kind of think through, because even a lot of the people that I see who are really active right now around Palestine, I know for certain they're not trying to build a better world. They just want this situation gone. And for me, that's not enough, right? For me, this is just a reality. And this is one reality that we're actually seeing and witnessing. But like even just yesterday, I saw, and this has been going on for a while with like the Armenian genocide, but Artsakh is like there are no more Armenians there for the first time in like thousands of years, right? And that's happening this week. It's happening like these past few weeks. And Israel is what sends a bunch of weapons to Azerbaijan, right? As they're doing all of this with Gaza, but that's not getting any coverage, and this one is. But that can switch so easily, right? A couple months later, if like there's no more missiles, it's no longer newsworthy. But it doesn't mean that Palestinians are free, right? Potentially, it doesn't mean that people are not getting killed anymore. It's just no longer on your social media feeds. And for most people, that's enough. That's actually why they do the things that they do. And I really want to challenge that of like, are you doing the things that you do for a better world? And if so, what are you actually going to do about it? This is long term. I'm not talking about today. I'm not talking about on a Wednesday or whatever day it is when you're listening to this. Um, I'm talking about longer term in terms of what is the world that we're actually building. Because for me, I'm here to build a much better world for everyone. And I wholeheartedly believe that that's possible. And not even just possible, but probable. Like it will happen. Settler colonialism is a baby in comparison to the extensive history of humanity and everything that came before that. Um, but not everyone is on the same page. Actually, I would say very few people are on the same page. And so just things for y'all to consider as you're thinking about this, because this is bigger than Palestine. Palestine is connected to everything else But if you don't recognize that, then you're not really showing up for everything else and everyone else. You're just showing up again to try to remove a situation that you're viewing as really bad and really that you just don't want to look at, basically. Um, but it's not about the situation ending permanently and sustainably.
Mm. That is such a good question to pose that I definitely agree. I feel like most people are not thinking about. And maybe they're thinking about it now because of, all of the propaganda and misinformation and the divisiveness that, oh, if I post something, I might lose followers, or, or I might, my friend Sally or whoever is going to think I'm anti Semitic. So thank you for posing that question. And I was thinking after I mentioned the different actions that we can take, contacting government officials, they unfortunately are not listening to all our heartfelt messages. So be quick, be concise, ask them to stop, to cease fire, to stop aid, and um, and that is an actionable item that you can do today to help if you feel like you're helpless and don't feel comfortable being involved in other ways. And Yaffa had a um, great statement that they mentioned that I'd like to to pick back up on here. Um, when it comes to, well, I'll just let you say what you said, Yaffa, and I'll bring it back to you.
Yeah, I think I was just saying that I think for a lot of people, the things that I'm sharing right now are things that they're hearing for the very first time. And often the reason that that is because we're told as marginalized people that it is our job to get privileged people to understand and stand up for us and to show up. And that if we push too much, then it is our fault that people are not showing up for us. And for me, I'm like, no, right? Like, if you don't like being called a settler, and that's going to deter you from standing up for literally the vast majority of the world, then that's on you. Like, that is not on me. I did not make you happen. That is on you. And I think for me, and this kind of goes back to a lot of the areas of the conversation that we've been having, and that we had on this podcast, right? Is really this idea of like, and this fear of shame, right? Of like, oh, I don't want to feel like I didn't do enough. And it's like, no, no, you didn't do enough. I didn't do enough. None of us have done enough. And that's why the world is the way that it is, right? And once enough of us do enough, this world that we live in does not exist anymore. Right. And so for people to sit with that, to just be like, you know what, like I actually have failed the Palestinian people. I have not shown up for them at all. That I haven't shown up for Armenians. I haven't shown up for Black people. I haven't shown up for the vast majority, if not every single African nation, right? I've not shown up for Indigenous folks here who are native to this land, right? To so many parts of the world, sit with that, right? That's shame. Shame is transformative, right? That allows you to actually really think about who do you want to be, right? What are your actual values? But you need shame to really dismantle the values that you're told that you're supposed to have versus the values that you actually have. So if your value is that you actually want to stand up for women and children, like, are you, right? Like, or are you standing up for white people, right? Like those are very different values, and shame is the way to really interrogate it, because if you've only shown up for white people historically, or cis people historically, or white cis people, or whatever it is that you've always shown up for, and even if you've shown up for a specific like privileged marginalized group, right? So if you've only shown up for cis straight Palestinians and not queer trans Palestinians, right? That is a shame task to really reflect on, of who do you actually want to be showing up for? Who do you want to be as a person? And to me, that's beautiful, right? Versus something to try to avoid at all costs. So if it makes you feel uncomfortable to be called a settler, wonderful, sit with it, right? If it makes you feel uncomfortable to think of that maybe some violence is okay, sit with it, sit with it, right? And really interrogate those contradictions within your values so that we're able to build a better world. But again, for me, it's not my job to move people to support me. I'm like, if you want me to beg for you to stand up for the rest of us, like, you're not, I don't want you standing with me, to be honest. You can stand over there, still stand, but over there, please.
Right.
I will be here. And when you're ready, without me having to do the labor to get you here, you can come here potentially if you're ready. But until then, stand over there, please. But stand.
Yes. I I love this. Shame as and transformative is such a powerful tool. Definitely one that I've been firsthand privy to. As I mentioned back in 2020, when I was sitting with this, discomfort of realizing as a light skin mixed person, that I have not had all of these very blatant racist things against me, and having that privilege of not knowing the systemic racism that goes on in this country because I haven't had to deal with it firsthand. It made me feel a lot of shame. It definitely did. And from that shame came beautiful things. I started standing up for what I believed in, and I sat with what I want, what my values are, what I want to stand for. And there's so much power in that. With that, it really reminds me of my yoga practice, and I bring everything back to yoga because this is the system that I live by. And there's this quote by Giovanna Hayman that says, yoga is not an escape from reality, but a deep dive into it. And it it makes me think of westernized yoga versus versus yoga in and of itself and what it's meant to do and meant to be. And if you've been following me and listening to me, then you know how whitewashed yoga is. I talk about how whitewashed yoga is, how westernized it is. And we have this perception of like love and light. We need peace. We can't look at these atrocities. We need to stay peaceful and mindful, and that is not yoga. That is spiritual bypassing. That is gaslighting yourself. That is looking away from that is the opposite of yoga, really, because you are disconnecting yourself from humanity, and yoga is unity. Yoga is yoga is unity, and it is also social justice. It's also like standing up for what is right, standing up for the liberation of all of us, because yoga is a liberatory system. So if you are listening to this and wondering like, why is this yoga teacher talking about like these subjects, because this is yoga right here. Like, this is the practice that we get to have. We get to sit in the discomfort and see what we can do about it, and how we can come back into connection with not only ourselves but with those around us and humanity. And with that said, I want to move on to onto this piece about, how do we resource ourselves? How do we regulate? And we were talking about this right before we started this recording. Of there was this video circulating around on Instagram of this person, I don't know who they are, saying, take the weekend off. A lot of things are so heavy right now. Take a load off, like, forget about all this. And I'm like, wow, what a stance. Because to me, no, I don't want to look away and forget. We get to, yes, we get to have rest, and we get to, because we need rest to continue, um resisting and speaking up and doing what we have to. But it doesn't mean that you just forget about everything that's going on, and there's different types of rest that we were talking about. So I'd love for you to chime in on that, Yaffa, a little bit, specifically what we were talking about before this of how of yeah, the different types of rest that you mentioned, of resting, in stillness, but still being with what is going on. If you could chat on that for a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So within my practice of rest, I really differentiate it between kind of like what you learn through yoga, through different other spiritual practices. I learned it through Islam first. It, it's a completely different concept than like white imperialist rest, right? White imperialist and capitalistic rest is basically how do you move yourself away from a situation? How do you just pretend like it's not there? How do you unplug, right? Nowadays, we use the word unplug so often, and it's not saying that that's always bad or not helpful, but it's not rest, right? That is a break. Rest is not a break necessarily. For me, rest is actually sitting in a situation. And I learned this in like Islam, where we pray like 5 times a day, right? This is why. When something is going on, you pray. Praying is not a way to avoid the situation. It's not a way to deflect away from the situation, but it's a moment of pause within the situation where you're not thinking about what do I do about this situation, right? But you're in it. You're soaking it in. You're resting. And I also learned it through like yin yoga. So with yin yoga, um, with every asana, you're fully relaxed into it, right? And you're sitting there for 5 to 20 minutes at a time, right? Potentially. And with that, what you actually do is you're actually engaging your deeper muscle tissues and your fascia in a way that you wouldn't with any other yoga asana practice, where you're actually engaging with your body. So when we engage, when we tense, when whatever it is that we do, we're actually only focusing on the surface level muscles on our body. When we're relaxed, when we're in stillness, we're engaging our much deeper things. And to me, that is the philosophy that I take to life. And with all of these things happening, is whenever you see something happening, our immediate response is let me do something about it. Let me go and talk about it. Let me go say something. Let me go and feel bad about myself. Whatever it is, right? You're always, but there's an action, right? It's I'm seeing something, right? Hearing something, whatever it is, I'm receiving something from the universe. And now I need to get away from it. And action is a way of getting away from things, right? Versus getting more towards it. Um, but imagine if like you saw the bombing of the hospital from a couple of days ago. Like when you hear this, it will be a couple of days ago. It happened yesterday. Um, and you just sat with it. And I mean sat with it, right? Not sat away from it, not turned off your phone, not just like went away in nature, completely separated from the situation, but just sat with it. Where this is a reality in the world that we live in, right? And that's where emotions like rage and shame, all of these really beautiful transformative emotions that we're taught are really bad emotions, that's where they get to come and really show up and move us towards transformation. But just pausing that rest in the space itself within the situation is actually what allows us to transform it, where it's constantly just moving and doing one thing after the other will never support our transformation. So if you immediately hear something and you go and pick up the phone and start doing things, that's wonderful. I'm not saying that that's bad, right? Call Congress a million times, call everyone, right? Make sure everyone knows about this, right? Spread the word, all of that. That hopefully will result in a ceasefire at some point. A ceasefire is not transformative. It doesn't actually eliminate any of the reasons that all of this has happened again and again and again and again for 75 years in Palestine and for hundreds beyond that in other places around the world. And so for us to get to that place where the root causes are eliminated, we need to sit within it. And you can do both. Right? You don't have to just be like, all right, well, I'm going to sit in this and watch this video on repeat for a while and do nothing for a couple of months. No, no, especially if you have privilege, go and do things. The rest of us have had to sit with this our entire lives to different capacities and different ways of being, which is why at times when we talk about it, we're talking about transformation. Right. I personally have not shared, like, I have not called for like a ceasefire, for example, because others are, and that's wonderful. I want others to. That's great. But I don't have to because everyone else is. And so I can focus on like, let's actually build a better society. Let's actually transform the world versus just focusing on how do we eliminate a single thing within a single place. Because to me, it's so much bigger than that, but that requires sitting in it and really sitting in it and doing the work within yourself and like exploring concepts of death for yourself, concepts of disability, all of these things that we're taught to be so afraid of, right? Our concepts of hope, our concepts of compassion, of love, all of the things. This is sitting in it that allows us to really redefine those things and work through them versus just taking action. Again, both are great. And also, for that better world, let's sit in things.
Mm. This is something that I feel everyone needs so much more of. It was so transformative, and I think that's why yoga practices, yoga teacher trainings are so transformative for people because they give us a chance to sit with our discomfort, sit with so many parts of ourselves that have been tucked away, not tended to, or parts of the world and what is going on that you've been, um, oblivious or just uneducated about. That is such an important practice, and I definitely back that statement. Um, Yaffa, thank you for mentioning that. I want us to talk a bit about resistance art because you have come out with this beautiful poetry collection called Blood Orange that I am just so excited to be able to share with people soon. That is going to be coming out on we're going to have a virtual book launch and some in-person as well, and people will be able to get it starting November 13th, correct? And we're going to see about how pre-sales will start. But first off, before we get into that a bit more, I'd love for you to just talk to us about resistance art because you've been experiencing this for, I imagine, most of your life as a displaced Palestinian. Um, and tell us like how what significance does resistance have art have? I think maybe let's start there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, resistance art to me is always significant with any kind of social movement, right? I don't believe that any social movement has ever existed that did not include resistance art, or that it was resistance art that potentially like catapulted different people together to create movements. Um, I think the cool thing with resistance art is it allows people to engage with with movements and with building this better world in a way that allows them to regenerate and heal in the same in at the same time. Right, art is regenerative. Art is moving us towards wholeness. It's healing at the same time. As we're creating these things, we're allowing things to be released, and at the same time they're working to transform society and move us in different directions. And I think that makes it much more accessible for individuals. So when we're talking about immigrants, for example, right, and maybe you're, or for example, like one of the big areas that I try raising awareness about, and something that I live with myself, right, is accessibility around protests on the ground, right? Especially with things like COVID, especially with um, not even especially, right? Just with everything. There's so many different types of disabilities and it's just so many things happening. And so for me, protests are not always available to me. And there's this idea of that if you're not on the ground with people, that you're not actually doing any resistance, right? That you're not showing up. I was like, no, no, that's one specific way of people to show up. Making phone calls, that's a different way of showing up. Creating an art piece is another way of showing up. Creating online communities where we have that space for stillness that's another way of showing up. And I think disability justice movement really like transformed a lot of people's understanding of how disabled people are able to show up. But even now, most people don't really think of that as like, oh, you could actually be thousands of miles away and still organize. Um, and I'll give an example of that where, like, within my life, where people were just shocked to learn that, like, this, like, organizing can be really accessible. When COVID started and everything shut down in March 2020, I was stuck in Jordan. Jordan closed their borders before the US did, and I was there for like the couple of weeks before to visit family. And Jordan closed their borders because two French tourists came into the country and started bringing COVID, and so they shut down the country, which was great. They did such a superb job at the time. Um, but I was in Jordan. At the same time, I was organizing mutual aid in the state of Connecticut and launched Connecticut Mutual Aid and then like 13 smaller groups, and we were supporting 30,000 people a week. I was stuck in Jordan the first 4 months of that. 98% of people did not notice that I was in Jordan and I wasn't in Connecticut. They didn't even notice. Like, literally, there was one person who noticed because they were like, where are you? The curtains behind you look like my children's grandmother's curtains who's from Syria. And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I'm in Jordan." And they were like, "I knew it." That was the only person who knew. And it wasn't like I was hiding it from anyone. It wasn't like I was like, "Yeah, I'm in Waterbury, Connecticut today." No, like, if people asked, like, I would tell them, but no one noticed, right? Because it's bullshit that you actually have to be in the exact same physical vicinity to do this work together. You don't, right? We can do so many incredible things from thousands of miles away. And again, I think that's where like art pieces really come in, of different performance art pieces or visual art pieces or written art pieces. And again, that makes it also accessible for immigrants because with art, you don't have to publicly share it as your art. Art lives on its own, right? So I didn't have to put Blood Orange by Yaffa, right? I'm in a place where I am comfortable being more out there. I've been out there for like since I was 19. I've dealt with the death threats. I've been doxxed. I've done all the things. Like, we're okay. I'm like, what are you gonna do? Murder me? Sure, okay. But you don't have to, right? You could be anonymous. You could have a pen name. Your visual art doesn't have to be associated directly with you. Um, so there's so many different ways to do this in a way that may feel unsafe by putting yourself out there. And maybe little by little, all of a sudden you do feel that actually you want to be associated with those things, or maybe you don't, and that's okay. But there's so much power in the creation of art. And I think art, for me, like one of the most beautiful things with it is that it really allows people to envision a better world. Um, and I would love to see a lot more of that. So a lot of my work is around utopia building. And one really cool thing with just literature, as an example, people assume that the world is what creates literature, right? So society is built first, and then that creates literature. But in reality, it's actually literature that creates the society that we live in. And so everything that we're talking about has already been in literature for a couple of hundred years, which is why it becomes so easy and so patternized, right? Just a pattern that happens again and again. Everything that happened within the Holocaust was already well documented in literature the 100 years prior to the Holocaust. Hitler did not invent anything new, did not come up with any creative ideas. And even like the establishment of Zionism existed 100 years prior in literature before it was an actual political movement that had political standing, right? And so I think of that because so many of us are only permitted to share stories of pain, right? Of like, here's my trauma, here's all the bad things that have happened. And very few places are willing to share, but here's what I want the world to look at like, right? Here's what a world that where the like trans identity does not exist anymore because cis identity does not exist anymore. This is what this world looks like, but there's very little that's around that. But art is a pathway for us to build that world. So if every story is about that world will happen. Like, give it a few decades, it will happen. It's not even up to the world. it will happen, right? If we talk about a free Palestine, right? If we envision a free Palestine, that's what's in our literature, that's in all the media and everything, it will happen. If we talk about a free world where settler colonialism does not exist anymore, it will happen. Um, it might take a little while, but it will happen. And I think that's so powerful in a way that other mediums might not allow you to do that. But with art, you're able to, like, it's an actual world building practice versus just, unfortunately, a lot of times we're like, oh, it's a hobby, it's cute. No, no, you're literally like training the parts of your mind that are that that need to be utilized to build a better world, because we don't utilize those, right? We don't utilize like vision building and utopia building, like neural pathways in our mind. But art allows us to slowly build that, where every situation that happens, all of a sudden it's like, yeah, why would utopia not happen? What are you talking about? You're being silly, like go away. It's kind of like where I'm at. I'm like, you like capitalism like that? Okay, bye. You go there.
I, as someone who has more recently really come into the role of artist, I just always love talking about the impact and power of art. So thank you for that reminder, and for anyone that's out there that's like, oh well, I'm not an artist, I don't paint, I don't do this, I don't do whatever. I I challenge you to reframe that thinking for a moment, because I feel like there are so many different ways of expressing ourselves artistically and creatively, and that all of those ways are very valid, and inherently we are creative individuals. And I think that the society that we live in, this capitalistic society, has very much downplayed art and made art, there's this the trope of the struggling artist and all of that like comes to mind when we think of art. But art in and of itself is so powerful and transformative too. uh so thank you for that reminder. And as we near the end of this podcast, I'd love to see if you are willing to share one of your poems from Blood Orange, if that's calling to you at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I will share um, one of the first few. And then you've already mentioned this, but so the book will be released November 13th. 13 is one of my favorite numbers, and so it just made sense there. And then, but folks will be able to pre-order it a couple weeks ahead of that. And then we'll have some in-person book launches, also in the Bay Area. If you want to also do like a reading in your community at like a local bookstore or something, definitely feel free to reach out and let us know, because I'm definitely happy to come to communities and meet folks and have these types of conversations. All right, so this one's called On Our Way. Our bodies polarize, yet make the news. I am conscious that other bodies do not. A privilege is a privilege, even when it starts and ends in genocide. Our bodies are powerful, yet lie underneath tons of concrete and rubble that smells of jasmine and sage glazed in orange and fig drizzled in olive oil that described Allah in a lantern beyond. Our minds warp under the weight of injustice and spilled blood, gaslighting and erasure, the weight of indigenous genocide fastened to our belts, released only when we are. Our people rise like wisps of rose water, breathing life into kunafe and pistachio ice cream on streets inscribed in memories lost to time, fertilizing homes we will return to before time begins. We are the beginning. and the end in a story, neither and yet both at the same time. We are Palestine. Call us by any other name, and we still are what we are: Palestinians, Palestine, Indigenous folks on our way.
Hmm. Wow. Thank you so much, Yaffa. That is so powerful, and the way you've weaved words to create this imagery that we've all been, witnessing, but it's it's just really powerful the way you've put it into words and created art out of it.
I appreciate that. And I will share with folks of the reason I love poetry in particular, because I also write novels, but poetry in particular, I love because you can do it anywhere, anytime, anywhere, and it's always perfect. And that took me a really long time to get to a place where I'm like, no, this is perfect, right? Like, I don't have to shift words and try to make it stronger because it was created in a moment of perfection. And to me, all poetry is always going to be perfect. Like, you could have all the grammar mistakes in it and it's still perfect because that's what it was meant to be, right? Like, that's what came forward. And I will say for folks, like to your point of that, a lot of people don't view themselves as artists. I have been told that I am a bad writer basically my entire life, right? Until basically a few years ago. I don't remember exactly when, but it's been a while where I was like, actually, my poetry is perfect. Like, well, or my writing is perfect. Like, I'm amazing. And then people are like, oh my God, so amazing. Right. And like, but all of it is subjective. Right. And I love that, like I aim for mediocrity when it comes to writing. Like, I want people to look at my writing and be like, wow, it's so mediocre. This is amazing. Because I want folks to feel like it's not I am the poet. It's you're a poet. This other person's a poet. Maybe you're a poet by making those congress people calls, right? Like, being able to speak concisely, that is poetry.
Hmm.
Maybe you're a poet by selling shit. Like, all of it is one and the same, and like there's just so many endless possibilities. Yeah, but reading that, to be honest, I was like, wow, this is so good.
Yes, it
Like, I
is.
was like, I forgot this poem.
That is by no means anywhere close to mediocre.
Yeah, I was like, wow. I mean, I wrote that poem like a few days ago, and so but completely forgot about it. And so, like, here we are. Which is again why I tell people of like, don't destroy your art. It's not yours to destroy. Of like, if you don't like something that you wrote today, maybe it wasn't you who wrote it. Maybe it was a previous like version of you that wrote it, or someone who's coming into the future, right? So 5 years from now, you is going to look at it and be like, this is the greatest thing that ever existed. Um, because it was meant for that person and it's not meant for you in that moment in time. So once it's like created, it's not ours anymore. Like, I don't view this as like, ooh, these are my poems. Like, I wrote them in a moment in time, but they're their own thing. They're not mine. I don't get to just go and erase them and be like, never talking about this again. In my head, at least, that's how I process things.
I really like that perspective on it. Hell yeah. And I am stoked to get to continue reading these and eventually share these with people. I would love to know if there's any closing remarks you might have as we come to the end of this conversation. Um, yeah.
Yeah, just really one main area. So a lot of people are really engaged right now with trying to support folks on the ground, which makes a lot of sense, right? We definitely want as much support going to Gaza, to the West Bank. Um, and also, I really want to invite individuals to invest in Palestinians within their own communities as well. And so a lot of us are dealing with a lot of hatred. Like, I was threatened with physical violence for the first time in person in a few years. It's like it had been a few years. Um, And I don't know any Palestinian, like, and I live in the Bay Area, right, which is supposedly one of the most progressive places in, like, the world. I don't know a single Palestinian here who has not been harassed in just the last 10 days. And we know that's going to continue to increase. And so, how do you also invest in resources and infrastructure for organizations that are doing the work to support us? So, even organizations like the one that I run, like Meshid, supporting queer and trans Palestinians. But there's also physical spaces that might be partially Palestinian owned, or maybe not even Palestinian, but are very pro-Palestinian, and so they are dealing with the brunt of it. So there's like a place that I'll be doing the book launch called Queer AF out on Castro Street, which is co-owned by a queer Palestinian. But the amount of hatred that they are experiencing and dealing with, and how that's potentially jeopardizing their ability to still be a part of the community within a couple of months, right? Like that's the reality that a lot of these radical spaces are dealing with. And so as you're investing uh, in different places, just always be, I always like to be really mindful of who's not receiving money, like where is money not going? Because your everyday person is going to send um, to the larger organizations, right? And which is wonderful as well. And also, don't forget that Palestinians also exist everywhere, and none of us are okay. Nobody has infrastructure. And especially as we move towards the election, this is the time for people to really invest in resources, because what's happening right now with Palestinians is going to happen for every single marginalized group between now and next November. It is going to get bad. They are going to come after all of y'all if they haven't already, right? Earlier in this year, they came after trans people, right? Now after Palestinians, and then Muslims, and then it's just going to go from one group to another, and they are going to attack all of us between now and November. And so this is the time to build out any resources that are going to be really instrumental for for everything, for our well-being, for just our survival, to be honest. And that's something that most people are usually like confused by, is when I say that I've lived in active war zones and in conflict zones and different areas. And also the US is like the biggest conflict zone that I can think of, because everywhere you are, you're always like, you never get a break from anything. You're always in the middle of things, but never in restful ways. Um, Right. And so really being mindful of that and investing in the communities that you're in, or the communities that you know that like Palestinians are in, and Indigenous folks and Black folks are in. Um, yeah, I'll leave folks with that.
Thank you, Yaffa. Um, it is very important to invest in resources for the Palestinian people, not just in Gaza, that of course are in dire need right now, but definitely all around the world, and especially in our communities. I am a huge community person as a community organizer and someone running a podcast called Lovin, Coven. I believe that community and love is at the heart of everything. So that is oh so important. I thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us, to really like to for the burden of educating us, but also for just being here and sharing your art, sharing with me. It's wonderful to be in community with you and get to learn and create with you. So thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for listening. And again, just follow Palestinians and folks advocating for all these things, and because we're all going to need each other, all of us.
We
Thank you for.
definitely are. All right, goodbye. Thank you so much for being here. If this resonated with you, please consider leaving a 5-star review or sharing this with a friend, or both if you're feeling generous. It would help so much in getting this episode to whoever needs to hear it. As always, I welcome any and all feedback, and I'm happy to answer any requests for topics at alovincoven@gmail.com. That's ALOVINCOVEN@gmail.com. Until next time, sending you so much love and care.